Good morning. It is sure good to see everybody. I think we've added a few since the last time I was standing up here. Good to see you all too. If you want to open your Bibles to James chapter 4, that's where we're going to be spending a little time in, and then a little bit of time in James chapter 5. But hopefully, as I said before, my voice will hold up until the end of this lesson. If not, we'll just have to cut it short, I guess. James chapter 4. Just a couple of brief um, reminders in the book of James as we've been looking through these chapters and learning about the things that James has to teach us. I can't help but just think, wow. I mean, James's words are so practical, they're so down to earth, but they're so applicable to our lives. And he really just, hits us in areas that we may not have expected. And so hopefully you're experiencing that as we're studying through this book. And it's one of those things I was thinking about this week. I was like, man, we're going to finish up James pretty soon. And I don't really want to, I love this book. I feel like it's such a good book to learn from and to teach. But just a couple of reminders. James has introduced us to wisdom. Wisdom, something that we ought to ask for, something that he wants us to have. And in James chapter 3, James says this. He says that about the wisdom that is from above, that it is first pure, that it is peaceable, that it is gentle and reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits. It's unwavering. It's without hypocrisy. And then he says in verse 18, and the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. And that's the product, that's the fruit of the kind of wisdom that God wants us to have and use in our life. And that's really what John is introducing us to and giving us, is that kind of wisdom to be able to make wise decisions, wise choices in our life. But then he also contrasts that with the wisdom that's from below, the wisdom that we might get from the earth. It's earthly. And he says, if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom, if James did air quotes, this wisdom is not that which comes down from above. It's earthly, it's demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder in every evil thing. So he gives us a contrast between these two kinds of wisdom. And he says, hey, there's this wisdom that you ought to ask for, and it comes from above, and these are the fruits of that kind of wisdom, and this is what you need to be using to make your life choices with. But then there's another kind of wisdom that comes from below. And it's inviting, obviously. It's present. It's readily available. It's probably what we would usually call common knowledge, for worldly living. And so he says, but that has a different type of fruit. That fruit from that kind of wisdom is not the kind of fruit that God wants you to have. It's not really the fruit that you really would want for yourself, but that's what you get if you follow that kind of wisdom. That's what you look for. And so these are the different kinds of wisdom. So we have to make this choice of which one we will choose. How will we make the decisions in our life? I was thinking about this from just kind of a natural perspective when you think about life in general. Everybody, as you grow up, whether you're graduating from college, whether you're, whatever the situation is, you have to make a choice in your life about what you're going to do for the rest of your life. What are you going to do for a living? How are you going to take care of your family? How are you going to provide means for your family? Those kinds of things. And then even while you're in the midst of that, there are times when you have these opportunities that pop up, right? And there are these seemingly great opportunities, and you think, man, that would be such a great job to have. There's more money, there's more opportunities. This is such a good thing for me, but it comes with a cost. It comes with a cost. Now, those opportunities don't always come with a cost, but this one does. This one does. This one comes with a cost because suddenly, instead of working, your 40 hours, you're working more like 60 and 70 hours. And instead of being home most of the time, you're gone 90% of the time. And then instead of being able to serve the church and work with the church community, you barely make it on Sunday mornings. And when you do make it, you're just exhausted and you're tired. You don't want to do anything, right? Because your time home is so limited. And so you find yourself kind of weighing the difference, right? And you think, okay, how am I going to make this decision? How am I going to choose what to do? Do I stay where I'm at, where, let's say you're comfortable? You may not be making as much as you want, but you're comfortable. You're doing well. You're serving the church. You're serving your family, your home. Or am I going to choose this other job that's going to give me so much more money? And you have to decide, what kind of wisdom will you use to decide what job you take? You keep the one you have, or you take the other one, right? And so those are some life decisions that we've all been faced with in our life, and similar ones to that. And we have to kind of work through that. What kind of wisdom will we use to make those kinds of choices? And so a similar scenario takes place. I don't know if it's taking place in this congregation that James is speaking to, or if it is just simply, like James often does, just a hypothetical scenario. But nonetheless, it's very similar to what we just discussed. So let's talk about it for a minute. This is James chapter 4 and verse 13. James says, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow, we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, engage in business, and make a profit." That's what he says. That's the group in which he's talking to, right? And so James gives this hypothetical scenario to make his point. And so let's kind of break it down a little bit and think about it before we go any further with it. So this person that he's talking about is very self-assertive in his travel plans. He's pretty certain of himself. He says, "Yep, I'm going to do that. That's what I'm going to do. I will go to such and such city." And then he's very self-confident in his scheduling. He says, "I'll spend a year there. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go. I'm going to spend a year there. I'm certain of that. That's my decision. I'm going to make it." And he's very self-centered in his trade relationships. He's thinking, when I get there, I'm going to make a profit, make some good money. Go in. I'm going to stay a year. I'm going to make some money. I'm going to come back. And he's just so focused on that idea that that's what I'm going to do. I want to make the point that the issue is not necessarily with the planning, and it's not with the work, and it's not with making money. God is all about those things. I mean, you read the scriptures, you read the Bible, you see that work can be very fulfilling. You see that God is very much into planning things. He's very much into preparing ahead of time for circumstances and situations. He has nothing against any of the individual items on the list. The problem is not with the planning, and it's not with the work, it's with the person. That word self, this is what I'm going to do. This is how long I'm going to do it. And this is going to be the result of my effort. That there is a focus that is only on self in the story. The issue is not with the planning, it's with the person. And James is not getting on to them. In fact, he even calls them, in regards to their relationship to business, but he calls them arrogant. They're arrogant. Why? Because they're just so focused on this idea, this self-assertiveness. I'm going to do this. They're confident in how long they're going to be there. They're certain about the profit they're going to make. And that's the end of the story. That's all they're focused on. And James says these people are arrogant. Look at verse 14. He says this, James says, "Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You're just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away." It's just steam, smoke and mirrors, if you will. It's a vapor. It there for a moment and then dissipates into nothing. And this is not one of those encouraging self-help speeches from James, right? This is not James saying, "You're good and everything's great in your life." James says, no, your life is short. Your life is short. You can't just go off and do whatever you want to do and think whatever you want to think and live however you want to live. Your life is incredibly short. And it's often shorter than we expect it to be. It's very short. And James wants them to know it's just a vapor. Your time is limited. And we have to make choices on how we're going to use that short period of time. Are we going to use that short period of time just doing whatever we want to do, feeding our desires, as James has pointed out in previous chapters, serving ourselves? Is that how we're going to use that really short period of time? Or seemingly something as innocent as making enough and having enough, providing for our families, which is not bad, but it can be. Something as seemingly innocent as that can actually be something bad if it becomes the focus of our heart. If it becomes the one thing that we decide, this is it, this is my entire life, I'm going to focus everything on this and nothing else, and if I achieve this, then everything is going to be good in my life. Everything is going to be right because I'm going to make it right. I'm going to have enough because I'm going to make enough. I'm going to do enough because I'm going to assert myself and do enough. I'm going to be enough because I'm going to make myself, create myself, indulge myself. And James says, oh, you arrogant person. You don't even know what tomorrow is going to bring. In fact, you don't even know if there is going to be a tomorrow. Your life is so incredibly short. That mindset needs to change. That focus needs to change. What are you going to do? How are you going to live your life? Look at verse 15. Yes, that's correct. Verse 15. He says, instead, you ought to say this: if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All boasting is evil. Therefore, to the one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. Now, that passage sometimes gets quoted by itself, but it's really connected with the point that James is trying to make here. So the wise choice doesn't always have to be an either or. I want that to be clear. It doesn't have to be an either or. In other words, you don't have to just give up on everything and live in poverty under a bridge and say, well, that's what I have to do in order to do the will of the Father. I have to get away from that life. Well, you know what? The truth is, and the fact of the matter is, you can live in poverty under a bridge and still not do the will of the Father. I mean, that's the reality of life. That has nothing to do with it. Or you can have and be comfortable in your life and have things and have funds and have a job that provides more than you need for your family, and you can be faithful to God. It's not an either or. You don't have to say to yourself, well, I guess I just have to be in poverty so I can serve God. No. You can serve God wherever you are, but that has to be the first choice. That has to be priority number one. To do the will of the Father has to be priority number one. And then, what does James say? Then go ahead and do this and that. Whatever this and that is. Go ahead and do it. Go ahead and engage in business. Go ahead and make business plans. Go ahead and prepare for the future. But it needs to be done with that mindset that says, my first priority, my first goal over everything else is to do the will of the Father. That's what I desire. And ultimately, it changes your choices, right? Back to our original scenario, we might think about that job situation, and we might think about the hours and the only incentive is the funds. It's the money. That's the only incentive. We may not take that job. Now, if it's a temporary thing and it's only going to be for a little while, and we know that, then we might say, yeah, I can handle that for a while. But if it's going to be a permanent fixture in your life, that's going to be your future, you might make a different choice. You might say, it's taking me away from my family. It's taking me away from the church. It's keeping me from serving God. I'm going to make a different choice. Yes, I may not fulfill that retirement goal as quickly as I hoped. I may not get that big boat, that I've been hoping for and whatever. I don't know. I'm just throwing things out there. But the idea is that you have to make those choices. And those choices need to be governed by the reality and the thought and the desire to serve God first in our life. And then those other choices will begin to make sense. Those other choices will begin to fall into place. Those other choices are going to be obvious choices, right? We're going to look at it, we're going to say, no, I can't do that. I don't have time for that. I have a family. I have obligations. I have work to do for the Lord. And so I'm going to make a different choice. And you know what your life is going to be? It's going to be peaceable. It's going to be gentle. It's going to be reasonable. It's going to be the fruits of making wise choices from above, putting God in first. Before we go out any business or do anything in our life, we have to ask that question. If the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. Our life is so incredibly short. And we have to make these choices. But those choices have to be governed by that reality. So the person James is describing is someone who he goes about his life basically looking for worldly gain, right? He's using worldly wisdom. He's not considering the will of the Father. It doesn't seem like he's seeking wisdom from above in any form or fashion. In other words, he's got it all figured out, right? He said, I know how to do this. I've got it all figured out. Don't mess with me. I've been doing this for years. We've all said that, right? I've got it all figured out. I know all the details. I know everything that's going on. You don't have to worry about it. I've got it. And God looks at a circumstance like that and he's like, no, you don't. You don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. You just think you have it figured out. You just think you have all the answers. What you really need to do is pray for wisdom, and I'll give it to you. And when you have it, you're going to realize really quickly that you just don't. And you're going to need to trust in God, because that's what we need to be. These are the choices that we need. We're going to move on to chapter 5. It's really a continuation of this idea, even though it may not feel that way at first, but you'll see where we're going with this. But James chapter 5, we're starting verse 1. James says this, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you." Now, I know I made this point before. I feel like I always need to make it when I say this. He's not talking about people that just have stuff and funds and money. It's not a general blanket statement for all the rich people in the world, so that's not what he's saying. Because in reality, and compared to the rest of the world, many of us fall into that category of having things, rich and wealth. But in the reality of the situation is he's condemning those who are selfish rich. They're rich and they know it, and they're leveraging their power that comes from their money to oppress and take advantage of other people. They're all in it for themselves. It's a selfish rich that he's really admonishing and talking to in these circumstances. And he wants to put them in their place. He says, you're arrogant. You trust in your stuff. You trust in your things. And yes, granted, the stuff that they have is putting them in a position in the society in which they live in as a higher, moves them up that chain. It moves them up that ladder of authority. But the question is not whether they're up there or not. The question is what they do when they get up there. What do you do in that position? How do you treat other people? How do you handle your life? How do you treat those who are in need? That's what James is really concerned about, right? And so he's talking to this group of people who he refers to as these arrogant rich people, right? You rich. He says what you need to be doing is you need to be weeping and howling. You need to be in misery because your wealth has taken you in a place where you don't need to be. You have put yourselves in a position of authority because of your wealth, and you're not using it for the glory of God. You're using it to advantage yourself and not for the advantage of God. God has always been. And if you've ever read the Old Testament, I know if you're engaged in your yearly Bible reading, you're reading through the Old Testament, and God has always been concerned for the less fortunate. He's always been concerned, as James said, pure and undefiled religion, to care for the orphans and the widows, to care for those who can't care for themselves. He has always been concerned. But he is always, when you see God get incredibly angry in the Bible, it's often because people, especially his own people, who he has blessed, who he has taken care of, who he has exalted, that they turn around and they oppress the poor amongst them, that they use them and take advantage of them, enslave them and treat them badly, add upon their current situation more stress than that needs to be instead of helping them and caring for them and loving them. And God, it just infuriates God in the Old Testament as we read through the scriptures. And it infuriates God today when his people who are given so much are not willing to give it all. And so that's what James is really focusing on, is this group of people that have, and they're just not willing to take care of those who don't have. And look what he says in verse 2. He says, your riches have rotted, and your garments have become moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver have rusted, and their rust will be a witness against you and will consume your flesh like fire. It is in the last days that you have stored up your treasures. You know, it's this stuff is only temporary idea. It's just stuff. It's only temporary. Yes, having it may put you in a different status than others, but it's just stuff. And James says it's rotting with you. It's corroding with you. It is being corrupted just as you are. And of course, this parallels with what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6, the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. Jesus' baby brother is probably thinking about these words as he's writing this in James. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth or rust destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. If our heart is on earthly gain, earthly power, authority, riches, then we're storing up for ourselves a treasure that will only be consumed by corruption and has already been. And we too, James says, we're going to be involved. We're going to be corrupting, corroding, disappearing with it. But Jesus makes the point, as James is making the point, that, you know what, there is something else that we can put our confidence in. There is a treasure that we can collect for ourselves, and it is one that will bring eternal gains. And the choice comes from wisdom. Do we use the wisdom from above to make the choice of the kind of treasure in which we will treasure up in our hearts? Or do we use wisdom from below to make that choice, which will lead to corruption and destruction? How will we do it? One of the other points that is made here is relationships. You know, God is so incredibly concerned about relationships. He's concerned about these things. He's concerned about our relationship with one another. He's concerned about our relationship with other people. He's concerned about our relationship with Him. That is who He is. He is a relational God. And He's concerned about the kinds of relationships we engage in. Remember these words, for where your heart or where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. We have to be careful what we treasure in our hearts. Look at verse 4. He says, behold, you pay the laborers. So this is how the rich are oppressing. You pay the laborers who mowed your fields, and which has been withheld by you. They cries out against you, and the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived luxuriously on the earth and led a life of wanton pleasure. It's kind of the American dream, if you will, just kind of life of pleasure and just a luxurious life and comfortable life. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. God is not deaf, we sometimes forget that God sees what happens on this earth, and I think that's where these people are. They're in a circumstance where, they're not paying the people what they deserve, and this is in a world where you pay by the day. You don't do this bi-weekly or bi-monthly paycheck. What you get is what you use to buy your food, for the day. Your fresh produce at the market. And so the withhold money is withholding more than just funds. It's food on the table. It's taking care of your family. And he's in essence saying, that's what you're doing. You have the money. You have the funds. The person did the work for you. There's nothing wrong with the transaction. The problem is you're not paying. You're holding back. Your heart is not in the right place. But then it says that God will hear the cries of those in whom you have oppressed. Those who you are using your position of power to oppress, God hears them. He's not deaf. This is not done in the shadows. This is not secret from God. God knows. He knows the people who are hurting, and he knows the people who are hurting people. He knows the people who are hurting, and he knows the people who are hurting people. God knows these things, and their cries are not far from his ears. The Sabaoth, that word is a little odd. We don't hear it very often, but it literally means Lord of hosts. It means mighty. It means powerful. It means glory. It means the God of hosts. So what is James saying? James is saying that the God, the Lord of hosts of all creation of heaven and earth, the Lord who has the power to do all things, is the God who hears the cries of those who you mistreat. Wow. You know, you would think that if a judge heard it or somebody on earth heard it, that would be, really scary. It'd be intimidating. But James says, oh no. Oh no. It is the God of hosts. It is the God of all things. It is the mighty, powerful, glorious God, full of love and compassion and mercy and justice. And he sees exactly what you're doing each and every day. Don't think that you can get away with it, even though it seems like you are. Because what does James says is right now you're living in luxury on earth. And your whole life is led by want and pleasure. You're just, we're just chilling and living well. You're comfortable. You have no concerns at all. You're out there sipping your sweet tea and with your ice, and you're watching them mow the lawn. You're thinking, boy, I'm glad that's not me out there mowing that lawn. And when they come to get their money, you say, yeah, I'll pay you tomorrow. God says, no. I see all of it. I see every bit of it. And their cries, they don't just go to the people around and fall on deaf ears, but they come right up into the heavens, and I hear them. And I'm not going to let it slide. I'm not going to let it go. Look at verse 6. He says, you have condemned and put to death the righteous man, and he does not resist you. If you think about those who have power and authority, and they're even putting to death those who don't for whatever reason, and James says those are the righteous. Those are the righteous people that you're putting to death. Now, not all of them, of course, were, but he says you're putting righteous people to death. Not just some lowly person. Not just somebody who has a low status in society that's not worth anything. That's not it. But you're putting the very people that God has raised up to an elevated status of righteousness. Those are the kinds of people you're putting to death. And no, they don't resist you. Part of the resist you is they can't, right? Using your power and your leverage in the world to take advantage of them. But another part of that is because they won't. They're the meek of this world. They're the righteous of this world. It's not within them. Character. They don't look to you as their judge. They look to God as their judge. And they will fall into the hands of a loving God to judge them rightly when you have judged them wrongly. Remember what God said? James said about God, the outcry of those who did the harvesting have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts. That's how we need to view ourselves. That's how we need to think about ourselves. That's how we need to live our life. Not only in the sense that we take care of other people, knowing that God is concerned about other people, but also in the sense that God knows everything we do, everything that we say, everything that we think, that God knows everything about us in all ways. And when we choose and make choices that hurt other people, God knows that too. And when those people cry out for mercy and justice and the world ignores them, God says that's all right because I hear them and I will enact justice. And that's where we get into a situation where we find ourselves fighting against the God, Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts. And so James just wants us to see very clearly in these contexts. He wants us to recognize within ourselves the frailties and the challenges, but also the pitfalls we fall into in regards to making important choices in our life. What kind of choices will you make? What kind of choices will you make in your life? And will you put the Lord and His will first in every choice that you make? If the Lord wills, then we will do. That's the wisdom that comes from above. So I hope you make those kinds of choices this week, and I hope you think about the wisdom that comes from above, because we all want the peace that comes from that kind of wisdom. If this morning maybe you're struggling with something, you need the prayers of this congregation, we're available for you. Let us pray for you. Maybe you have not put on Jesus in baptism. Maybe you haven't made that step of faith. Let us help you with that this morning. If you would come forward as we stand and as we sing.